Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that I started before, talking about Baudrillard in the context of space privatization. I really enjoy being able to go through and talk about like all the ways that I think that Baudrillard has like really interesting like things to say about this resolution. And in the last couple of videos we started off by just like talking about the intro to Baudrillard on space, thinking about like what are some of the most relevant ideas that Baudrillard is kind of like written about in the context of like what's relevant for the space resolution. And in this video I kind of want to continue what we started down, which is talking about what Baudrillard looks like as a negative strategy versus a lot of policy teams. If you haven't, I would go back to and at least watch the last video that I did talking about this or starting this conversation off, because in it we kind of like start talking about like what are some of the like priorities, the framing arguments and thesis arguments that you really need to have in order to like have like a really solid control over like what you really want to frame this debate around, and where you should be kind of like situating a lot of your time so that you have a much easier way of being able to navigate some of the stuff that we'll be talking about in this video, which will be much more about the link debate, permutation debating, impact comparison, and alternative debating. All these things I think are really interesting because I think that they're able to kind of like basically build ways for you to have really specific contextualization and argumentation about like what particular parts of the policy affirmatives that you're disagreeing with. And I think that being able to think about the effect that like fiat and the way that we portray particular imagery in the context of debate has as a kind of like pertinent framing for what we think about in terms of just the world writ large can be really helpful in terms of giving you a much better idea for like what you should be kind of like trying to accomplish with each portion of these debates, and also a better idea for how you're able to kind of like tie some of the like more like symbolic concerns that you're taking up with the affirmative to like a more like kind of like material set of level of impacts and things like that can be easier to pitch towards a lot of judges and stuff like that. And so in this particular video I just want to start off a little bit talking about the link debate. I think that link debating with Baudrillard is like relatively something that I feel like a lot of policy teams really lack on. It is a place where you can like basically create and make your life a lot easier, because I feel like a lot of the arguments that you'll make will be link arguments that they don't really know link out of, but instead try to kind of like find a particular like argument to make in terms of like why the private sphere is net worse, or like why these things are kind of like inevitable in the status quo. And I feel like a lot of the arguments that you kind of need to make are about how you can kind of set up why the way in which they're framing the world and like what is kind of like eventual and inevitable in the first place is particularly wrong. I think that this can be done like through the alternative, but also to get to question of how you situate like where you're garnering your link arguments from. The first thing is that I think that there are a lot of arguments that I think you should be making about like why the way in which they're thinking about like making basically space a particular like only public affair is one that kind of like is able to like mimic and basically translate like a lot of the responses that are like geared during the Cold War. And I think that a lot of the arguments that you can make is that like the space race was basically used in order to like erase and like kind of make like out of the public's purview the ability to think about like how the US was like funding various warfares, how different countries were basically extracting resources from third world countries in order to like make them to get the materials necessary in order to like basically have the space race in the first place, and like how all of these factors kind of contributed to like the necessity of being able to create a particular production of the space program that seemed like it was all for human benefit. The idea of taking one small step for mankind, etc., and being able to stop the eventuality of like any type of like incoming asteroids or anything like that from coming to Earth have all been like heavily situated not only like within like the symbolic nature of like American history, but also in like the famous kind of like science fictions that run a lot of like the ways in which we're able to think about the role that space is playing in the world around us. I did think that being able to like pair this with like the way in which the 1AC is particularly, for instance, through its like impact calculus or through its ability to kind of like basically beat down the idea of private space in order to like basically romanticize public space as all kind of like reminiscent of these same values that show up in the context of the Cold War, and that could justify the kind of like continuation of such systems of violence that are kind of like the symbolic power of like why talking about space is relevant, could be really helpful in you being able to build link arguments that kind of show the various effects of kind of like ontologizing science and technology in the way that the affirmative does, by like allowing like the idea of like the public and that kind of being read as like this united kind of like white community as something that's able to like ascend into space in order to continue the survival of humanity is one that kind of creates a particularly like violent relationship to how we're thinking about the role that like humanity has in the world. The idea of just like being able to kind of like sacrifice everything or be able to continually use up resources on other planets in order to continue the kind of like the life sustenance of humanity, etc., are all interesting ways for you to think about why the particular paradigm that they're forwarding would make like for instance, things like that type of like skills that they're saying that are good come from policy and all things like that, even if they were true in the context of you like seeing the internal link to them, means that they actually are like bad things, and then skills that produce a particular relationship to the world that is like sacrificial at nature, and that ultimately kind of like uses up various human lives and various like resources as kind of like things that are like necessarily valuable for the context of producing the space race. And I think making arguments about like why this also allows us to erase like how we're ultimately sacrificing human life in order to do this in the context of, even if you think about things like the challenge of disaster and stuff like that, then there are a lot of really interesting imagery to pull from, and how you're making these like arguments kind of like sit with judges in a variety of ways. I then think that when you go to places like the permutation, making a lot of arguments that I think about the difference between content and form, about like the 1AC at like a form level is particularly still kind of like is still locked into a lot of the ways in which like the state is attempting to romanticize space in a variety of ways, is like super important. I definitely think that in the context of this criticism, that there are a lot of reasons why you should kind of be saying no to the context of space overall, that you should kind of be like doing like forms of radical mimicry and other things that kind of like meme their idea of like what space exploration should look like. And I think that making arguments about how you kind of like refuse all the paradigms that make the 1AC productive in the context of discovering like new value to space and stuff like that as necessarily violent and part of like a system of like kind of like arrangement that you're indicting. And I think that being able to do all of these things can make it like a lot easier for you to be able to kind of like make argumentation about like why the link arguments that you're making are so pertinent in the context of a permutation. I then think that when you go on to impact comparison, a lot of the arguments that you want to make is not the idea of being able to compare like material to material in the context of what the judge should be viewing, but making arguments about like why like particular symbolic imagery and simulacra kind of drive the way in which we're able to think about material violence, why it's able to kind of like kickstart and justify and basically create smoke screen for various forms of colonialism and other forms of structural violence to continue, and why that means that there can be no like ethical way of evaluating the 1AC because its propaganda is made to kind of like erase our ability to understand like why these other contingencies are particularly important, are all really relevant factors for how you're able to make sense of like the comparison between the AF and the criticism. And I then think that when you move to the alternative, it's really a question of whether or not you want to use a lot of this stuff from earlier on in the debate to develop arguments about like kind of using like forces of like radical mimicry and other things to kind of like meme or kind of like make fun of the way in which they're positioning themselves in space, and maybe like think about an alternative relationship. Or if you think that there should just be an argument about why refusal and kind of sending them back to the drawing board is the only way to continue like to frustrate the system, to break the way in which we're thinking about how pervasive the form of like how they're thinking about space, time, science, and technology is, and using that as kind of like a kickstart to like why you're able to use kind of all the net benefits to all the offense you're using before as reasons why that alternative makes sense and why that refusal is necessary. Then you kind of have like a lot of choice in terms of like where you're pivoting to like what you want the alternative to do. And I think it's really just in terms of like what your comfortability is and what you have the best time explaining it in conjunction with a lot of the other arguments that we were making before. And so hopefully this video and a lot of the other videos have been helpful in terms of thinking about like how Baudrillard and space privatization are relevant and what we should kind of be thinking about in terms of like developing this in the context of like LD and other skills. And hopefully you'll tune in for more. Thank you as always.